It's the Brian Lehrer Show. I'm producer Amina Serna, filling in for Brian today. This weekend, the G20 convenes in Johannesburg, the first time the summit has ever been held on African soil. South Africa has hoped this would be a moment of global leadership for President Cyril Ramaphosa and symbolically for the continent. But in the past few weeks, the U.S. pulled out entirely, and China's Xi Jinping said he won't attend, taking some of the shine off of what was meant to be a historic gathering. Still, as Semafor Africa's Yinka Adegoke, reports, South Africa has used its G20 presidency to elevate a set of issues that matter deeply to African nations. That includes the continent's mounting debt burden, the question of how to pay for a just energy transition, and the reality that in many countries, more money is now flowing out to foreign creditors and then coming in as new financing. So, what does the U.S. boycott actually change? And what does a successful summit look like when major powers aren't in the room? We'll get to all of that now with Yinka Adegoke, editor of Semafor Africa. Hi, Yinka. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thank you for having me again.
And listeners, if you have ties to Africa or if you follow Africa, global politics, or international development, what do you make of the U.S. skipping this G20? And what issues do you think African leaders most need the world to hear right now? 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. Call or text. Yinka, you write that South Africa was heading into this week expecting a major moment of global leadership until the U.S. boycott and Xi Jinping's no-show. How have those decisions been received in South Africa?
Well, we do know that President Ramaphosa sort of had to do a kind of diplomatic shrug and say, well, it's their loss not to be there. That's a direct quote from him ahead of this. But let's be clear about this. There are two things going on here. The first is that, the U.S., or rather more correctly, the Trump administration is very unfriendly towards what you might call multilateral diplomacy. It's not just about the G20. You could see it with its sort of pulling out of the WHO, the World Health Organization, from January 1st. The United States is not at COP, right now, going on in Brazil. It's had all kinds of comments about things to do with the United Nations and weakening that organization. So, just generally, President Trump, the Trump administration, is just not a fan of multilateral organizations or just multilateral diplomacy or just this idea that, because for him, you get the sense that everything is about, doing individual deals and working with different presidents and counterparts and not this kind of working together and this kind of partnerships where we all grow together and we all, countries develop. It kind of is like happy talk to these guys, right? This is something that they don't care about very much. The other thing that is more specific to this situation is that he really has a bee in his bonnet about this particular South African government. Ever since Elon Musk put it in his ear that there's killing of white African farmers, which is untrue, is been proven time and time again not to be true. He's just had a real bee in his bonnet. Back in May, he literally attacked President Ramaphosa in the White House Oval Office. So he wants to stick to that, and basically he pulled that up again in pulling out of the G20, calling it a disgrace that South Africa has been allowed to host this event, even though it's the first time it's been held in Africa, and let's be clear, that can be seen in a certain way as well. Like the first time Africa hosts this, and you say we're not going, and no one from your administration should go. And if you think about it, even when we talk about President Xi not going from China, and we shouldn't put them on the same
Hmm.
in the same basket because China is fully represented here, and President Xi has not really been going to multilateral events himself in person, but China gets well represented, and they are very strong partners with South Africa and other African countries, as we hear
Yep.
repeatedly from the United States.
Well, Yinka, to that bee in Trump's bonnet, as you put it, I'll just note for listeners are probably familiar that Musk is of South African
Yes,
origin.
correct.
So that is probably why this, if listeners are scratching their heads, just to mention that. But Trump's nominee for U.S. Ambassador to South Africa, Leo Brent Bozell, is a conservative media personality with no diplomatic background. Bozell has talked about a so-called, quote, white genocide. So how is that rhetoric shaping how South Africans view the U.S. boycott and the broader U.S. South African relationship right now?
I think the reality is, like in most countries, there is of course a minority of white South Africans, and undoubtedly they have South Africa has had a very recent history of a lot of violence, but it does not happen largely to white South Africans. Um, but at the same time, you can tell that even when you talk to um, uh, white South Africans themselves, they kind of acknowledge that this is they like their they love staying in their country. They have a good life here. All right, I'm in Johannesburg, and I flew in earlier this week, and I was talking to a white African, a farmer, on my flight, and I said, where are you coming from? And he said, North Dakota. And what were you doing there? And he said, oh, I go there and work for 6 months of the year farming. I was like, okay, so are you moving to the US? He said, no, 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 no. I have no. The US is too expensive for me. I like my life in Free State or wherever he was from. The reality is, if white South Africans are being killed every day, this is not the kind of thing you would hear. You would hear about people being desperate to
To
move
move. Hmm.
to move, and this is not what you hear. So, um, people are feel defensive, feel offended, but they also acknowledge there's a kind of reality that there are challenges in South Africa itself for ordinary, everyday South Africans of all races, but particularly the majority who are the poorest, the Black South Africans. So that remains a reality that this country is trying to solve as well.
And listeners, if you're just joining us, my guest is Yinka Adegoke, editor of Semafor Africa. We're talking about the G20 summit, which kicks off in Johannesburg, South Africa this weekend. Listeners, if you have ties to Africa or if you follow Africa, global politics, international development, any of that, what do you make of the U.S. skipping this G20? Or what other issues do you think African leaders most need the world to hear right now? 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. Caller text. Let's go to a caller. Rudolph in South Park, New York. Rudolph, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Hi, how are you doing? Thank you so much for the show. Yinka, thank you for coming. I have a question. Can you explain to listeners why is President Bola Tinubu going to South Africa? Initially, we were told that he was going to go there to meet with the American delegation, and now they are not going there, and he's still going, knowing that they kidnapped some kids, school kids in Nigeria, in Kebbi, and they killed a general, the terrorists, and also yesterday they attacked a church and killed worshippers. Under that condition, why will a Nigerian president go to South Africa for G20? And the other question, since these Americans are not coming, the Chinese president is not coming, can you, as somebody in the media space, make a case for Africans leaders who go to Washington and go to Russia? They are summoned, they all rush to those places for meetings. What's going on? Why is this happening?
Rudolph, thank you so much for your call. Yinka, two questions there. Where do you want to respond?
Yeah. Well, it's difficult to speak for Nigeria in this case. I mean, I am Nigerian as well, and I obviously pay attention to Nigerian politics. I would say that if you're one of the criticisms of President Tinubu has been, a sort of lack of international engagement, if you like, a lot of sort of being very inward looking. So actually seeing him attending the G20, if this is correct, if he does show up, would be would be interesting, would be unusual because he hasn't done that very often, and he hasn't, sort of been out to some of the usual places, some of the usual countries that a lot of African presidents tend to go. But that's not, if the idea is he was going to go there to meet Americans, that would have made sense anyway. He would just need to engage Americans, perhaps, in Washington. And what was the second question again? That
Uh,
was about, oh yes, about African presidents going African leaders in general going to all these other countries when they're
yeah.
invited. This is clearly a bugbear for many Africa watchers who, get frustrated that there's this whole thing called the Africa plus one kind of summit where every country, Italy has an Africa summit and presidents go, and France has an Africa summit, and it's always plus one. It's just one country and then all these other countries that turn up, and and I think increasingly, as you can see with some of the protests from Gen Z and other people on the continent, there's a lot of growing frustration that these presidents are not fixing the problems. But here's the other challenge for them is that they need to also raise funds for their countries,
Hmm.
right? They have these young populations, they have all the sorts of challenges around infrastructure deficits and other kinds of so many other problems. They have lots of debt,
Hmm.
which this is one of the big talking points at G20, and one of the things that South Africa has kind of been successful with, sort of putting on the table, which is this idea that there are so many countries on the continent who spend more paying interest on their debt than they do on health or than they do on education. And when you have a young population and you're not building schools and you're not building hospitals to take care of your populace, it's a recipe book for disaster in the long term, right? So they're kind of caught between these two places with these two very difficult situations where, yes, sure, it doesn't look great politically to keep on going to these usually former colonial powers or what have you. But at the same time, if you are not negotiating and trying to bring investment into your country, you are stuck in a very tough situation. South Africa has done a good job in just sort of getting people to think about these issues because many countries really need their debt to be renegotiated to lower interest on debt. The cost of capital for many countries is way too high. And more countries are working on this now, trying to figure out ways that they pay less on their debt every quarter.
Well, let's explain what that kind of looks like a little bit. You highlight that last year, 17 African countries saw more money flowing out to foreign creditors than
Yes.
coming in as new financing. So for listeners, what does that actually look like on the ground?
What that looks like on the ground is that, as I was saying, schools don't get built. The governments become almost unable, well, quite frankly, really unable to take care of their citizenship, right? They're one of the problems you see in many sort of regions like take one like the Sahel for instance. You have countries where half the country or two-thirds of the country is controlled by insurgents, right? In Burkina Faso as one example, or Mali, right? And why is that? It's because the governments don't have enough resources to be able to even fund to keep their citizens safe. How would they normally raise those funds? They would normally be able to have people paying taxes, have it, running businesses and all the rest of it, and none of that is happening. It's not just about, not being competent or corruption and all the rest of it. Those are all part of the mix, clearly, but uh, there are just fundamental problems which require countries to have less, even when they borrow, to have debt that they can actually manage. So all these things are kind of all linked together, where there's too much interest when they borrow, they're very happy to borrow the money, but then they haven't kind of worked out how they're going to pay this back. So this is kind of the incompetence part of it.
And
So
mhm. Please go ahead.
yeah, no, I was just going to wrap up and say, and that's how you get to the situation where, you know, they end up spending all this money on interest every quarter to, it could be banks in Europe or on Wall Street, what have you. Meanwhile, ordinary people, um, have no hospitals, have no schools,
Mhm.
have no, sort of basic materials that they need for daily life.
And how central is that reality to South Africa's message at the summit? And are other G20 governments genuinely receptive to it?
Well, that's a really great question when you say whether other countries are receptive to it. I mean, and this is the kind of the point, right, about consensus. Um, the the fact that South Africa puts this on the table raises the profile of this topic, and then you're supposed to have a kind of, you know, a consensus where they agree to some of the, we will keep talking about this. We will be thinking about this. We will align on some of these topics, right? That kind of moves, it kind of moves the issue forward as against let's not like it's they're going to hand over to the United States, at the end of the year. And you can imagine that these some of these topics will be nowhere on the agenda, right? But if South Africa has at least managed to put it, up to a certain stage on the agenda, it forces countries to have to consider it. And then, it just works its way through. And that's kind of the hope. You can only put things on the table, and if they're not there at all, then, what is the point of G20 for Africa,
One of the people you spoke to while reporting this story is Hannah Ryder, who leads a development focused
Yeah,
consultancy called Development Reimagined. She agrees that South Africa has elevated the debt issue, but argues the U.S. withdrawal still really matters, especially because Washington
absolutely.
holds veto power at the IMF. What parts of the agenda become harder or maybe even impossible without the U.S. engaged?
Well, that the finance part, because so much of the way the post World War II Bretton Woods structure was set up just means that the United States has a lot to say over, World Bank and even the IMF, even though the leadership of the IMF is often left to the Europeans, but they're all headquartered in Washington, D.C. Um, and frankly, if you want to really kind of see, I mean, just sort of breaking news in the last sort of few hours that even though the United States is not here, they're still trying to affect what South Africa can, as the leader of the G20 right now, what it can leave on the table, right? So South Africa is obviously pushing for more consensus, more unity, more alignment, but the US is saying, well, whatever you guys decide right now cannot be recognized because we're not there. So they literally have put this in writing, according to some reports. So the United States still matters, even when they're not in the room, right? They still, you can always imagine, as we've seen in so many other situations, that the Europeans in particular will tend to just go along with whatever the United States um, demands, unless it's, not in their particular interest. But if it's about the global South and Africans, then they'll probably just go along with whatever the US demands.
Yinka, as we run out of time in this segment, I want to get your take on some of the issues beyond debt, or one in particular. South Africa is pushing green financing and disaster response as a major agenda item. What's actually in those proposals? And given the continent's accelerating climate shocks, is this being seen as a potential pivot on climate finance?
Well, it's not so much a pivot as it's like something that African countries have been calling for a long time. And frankly, even before G20, South Africa has been a leader on this. Listen, you've heard this quoted many times before, how little the African continent contributes to the sort of the damage
Greenhouse
that
gas emissions.
greenhouse gases that man has contributed. And so little of that is coming from the African continent,
Right,
but so
compared to
much
the
of the
US.
impact, yeah, exactly, compared to the US or China. Um, but so much of the damage, so much of the impact is happening on the continent, right? And these are countries that really, many of the countries, pretty much all of them, um, will struggle to be able to protect themselves and to upgrade infrastructure. Well, all the billions of dollars you need to be able to adapt. And I the agenda that South Africa has raised on this is certainly something that is being discussed. Nothing has really changed in the kind of the way that everyone expected it to change by now. Let's be frank, that it feels like there has been a setback in the last year. Um, but of course, it's one of those topics where people remain hopeful and believe that, powerful nations and wealthier nations will come round to understanding that it's also in their interest to support um, poorer countries, whether they're in Africa or South Asia or wherever, because people will be forced to move and all the other challenges that will happen as we start to see the impacts of climate change really affect everyday people everywhere.
More remains to be seen as the G20 summit kicks off in Johannesburg this weekend. We'll leave it there for now with Yinka Adegoke, editor of Semafor Africa. Yinka, thank you so much for this.
Thank you for having me.